Hey guys, tonight we slip into something far older than any bedtime story you've ever heard. A place where the world hasn't yet decided whether it even wants to exist. You're floating in the silent, suffocating blackness of chaos. No stars, no ground, no sky. Just the kind of void that makes your stomach churn and your mind start whispering. You probably won't survive this, but hey, it's Greek mythology, so survival is always negotiable, right? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fun to know if you're curled up in midnight darkness or stealing a sleepy afternoon break. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hover in chaos, and then, without warning, shapes begin to bloom from nothing. First Gaia, the earth, stretching herself wide and solid. Then Tartarus, the deep pit below, so bottomless you get dizzy just thinking about falling. And then Eros, the force of desire and attraction, pulsing like a cosmic heartbeat that starts pushing things to connect, to join, to multiply. In a sense, you're watching the Big Bang as told by poets instead of physicists. Though, fun fact, historians still argue whether Hesiod's theogony was ever meant to be read as science, or simply as poetry dressed in sacred metaphor. From chaos Nyx, the night emerges with her velvety wings, and from her bright Hemra day slips forth, so that now you finally have contrast, dark and light, rest and waking, and you realize the Greeks, for all their storytelling flair, were really mapping human experience onto the cosmos, because what's scarier than an endless night that never ends? You drift closer and watch Gaia give birth to Uranus, the starry sky, a shimmering dome stretched over her body, and the two lock into a strange embrace, where earth and sky become parents to the first generation of beings. The Titans, Cyclopes, and Hecatonchires, giants with 100 hands, whose name alone makes you shudder, because who needs that many limbs unless you're planning to throw some seriously chaotic parties or equally chaotic wars? There's a quirky tidbit you probably didn't know. Some later writers insisted the 100-handed giants were so terrifying that even the gods didn't want to talk about them, like they were that awkward relative everyone pretends not to notice at family gatherings. You hover as Uranus, proud and insecure, fears his children, shoving them back into Gaia's womb, pressing them deep inside her so they can't roam, and you feel her anguish. Stretching across the soil, a mother crushed by the weight of a sky that refuses to let her creations breathe. And here is where the first whispers of rebellion stir. Gaia, resourceful as ever, crafts a sickle from flint and beckons her children to act. But only Cronus, the youngest Titan, answers, stepping forward with the kind of teenage defiance that's about to change the universe. One night, as Uranus leans over Gaia, Cronus lunges with the sickle and castrates his father, the blood spilling onto the earth, giving rise to the fury spirits of vengeance, while the severed parts fall into the sea, frothing and swirling, until Aphrodite herself is born from the foam, a goddess of love. Birthed from violence, beauty rising from brutality, which is such a Greek thing to do, weaving contradictions into every origin. You linger on this moment because it says so much. The cosmos, in this mythology, isn't neat or gentle. It's messy, shocking, and profoundly human in its rawness. And yet, Cronus doesn't simply free his siblings. He crowns himself ruler, ushering in what poets later call the Golden Age. though you can't help but smirk at how golden it really was, since it starts with bloodshed. Meanwhile, Nyx's brood continues to multiply in the shadows. Death, doom, dreams, and even morals, the spirit of fate, reminding you that night is never just rested, carries the baggage of inevitability. A mainstream historical fact here. Ancient Athenians actually built small shrines to Nyx because they believed acknowledging night's power was the only way to keep dreams from becoming nightmares. You imagine them whispering prayers before bed, the same way you might mutter to yourself before hitting play on a sleep podcast. And as the primordial generations unfold, you see the groundwork for everything else. Zeus' storms, Hera's grudges, Aeschylus' ragel, seated in this primal family drama, where the earth aches under her sky, sons overthrow fathers, and desire drives creation as much as destruction. You drift further, almost lulled by the rhythm, but you keep circling back to one scholarly debate. Was chaos really a void, or was it more like a raw material? A formless soup that the gods shaped into patterns. The poets don't exactly hand you a glossary, and so you're left dangling, staring into the abyss, realizing that sometimes even the scholars don't have a clue, and that mystery is half the point. So here you float, eyes heavy, listening to the hum of the cosmos, settling into its first shaky balance as Gaia exhales in relief. Cronus grips his new throne with nervous pride, and somewhere, in the foam of the sea, Aphrodite shimmers like a dream. You almost forget the moment you wake. You're still drifting in the haze of creation when you feel the ground beneath your feet solidify into Gaia's skin. The earth, steady and vast, and you look up to find the shimmering dome of Uranus fading, dethroned, his presence scattered like stardust, while the children he once imprisoned now step cautiously into the open. Their forms immense and strange, the titans stretching taller than mountains, their eyes burning with a glow that makes you wonder whether you're supposed to bow or bolt. But there's no escaping this family drama, because you're standing right in the heart of it, watching as the first generations of beings test their strength against each other and against the world that barely knows how to hold them. Cronus, fresh from his grisly victory, doesn't waste time acting like the doting brother or the liberator. Instead, he seizes command, demanding loyalty from his fellow titans Oceanus, Hyperion, Cous, Crius, Iapetus, and the rest, his voice booming like a storm across valleys that still smell of new soil. And they rally to him partly out of fear, partly because the cycle of dominance is already etched into their blood. Fathers toppled by sons, brothers wrestling brothers, and everyone sensing that if you're not the one holding the sickle, you're the one being cut. You notice Oceanus, titan of the great river that encircles the world, swirling his waters as if testing the edges of the earth, while Hyperion lifts his face toward the blazing light that hasn't yet been named. Son his children destined to define the rhythms of day and night, and Iapetus, more ominous, already plotting the lineage that will lead to Prometheus, and through him to you tiny humans listening in bed centuries later, wondering how these cosmic squabbles could possibly shape your Monday morning commute. The Cyclopes emerge to one-eyed smiths with 4 arms like tree trunks, their gaze sharp as if already measuring metal that doesn't exist yet. And then the Hecatonchires stomp forth, 100 hands fanning around them like a nightmarish halo, 50 heads glaring in every direction, and you can almost hear their footsteps echo in your bones. The kind of sound that makes you realize why later poets might have quietly trimmed them out of reap weddings. Because bedtime stories are one thing, but bedtime horrors are another. Still, historians still argue whether these monstrous children were symbolic of natural forces, volcanoes, earthquakes, storms, or whether they were just Hesiod's way of telling you, yeah, creation is messy, don't expect perfection. Meanwhile, Gaia herself doesn't disappear into the background. She continues scheming, because if Uranus' reign proved anything, it's that rulers are disposable, and mothers have long memories. You linger near her as she whispers into Cronus' ear, urging him to protect his throne, but also reminding him that power isn't meant to be hoarded. Though he predictably, paranoid, begins swallowing his own children the moment they're born, ensuring no son will ever rise against him, the way he rose against his father. Ironic, isn't it, that the one who once rebelled now becomes the tyrant he hated? But before that cycle tightens, you stand in the age of titans, when the world is still fresh and their stories weave into rivers, mountains, and constellations, each titan embodying something that shapes how humans later understand their world. For instance, Mnemosyne, Titaness of Memory, will give birth to the Muses, whose whispers you'll hear in every poem, every song, even in the way I'm narrating this to you right now, and Themis, Titaness of Divine Law plants seeds of justice that later generations will twist into oaths and courts, reminding you that even chaos needs rules if it's going to survive more than one afternoon. A quirky tidbit slips in here. Some fragments suggest that the Titans were worshipped in rural Greek regions long after the Olympians became fashionable, almost like underground celebrities that refused to leave the stage, their shrines hidden in valleys, where farmers poured libations, just in case Zeus wasn't listening, but old Cronus still was. You walk among them, and though their forms are intimidating, there's something oddly human in their squabbles. The way they bicker over domains, the way Oceana sulks when Hyperion claims too much of the light the way Crius seems content to linger on the fringes, forgotten like that one cousin who never texts back. Slowly, though, a heaviness creeps into the air, because Cronus' paranoia is festering. The prophecy already whispering through the leaves. One of his children will overthrow him, just as he overthrew Uranus. The moment Rhea, his sister and wife, starts giving birth, Cronus acts with cold precision, swallowing Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon whole, his jaw snapping like a serpent. Each child vanishing into the cavern of his stomach, where their cries echo but never fade. And you shiver, imagining the claustrophobic nightmare of being alive but trapped inside your father's body, waiting centuries for rescue. Scholars still argue whether this gruesome act was symbolic of time devouring all things Cronus named. After all, echoes Chronos, time itself, or whether it was simply a cautionary tale about what happens when fear runs a household. And yet Rhea, weary and grieving, plots her own rebellion, the kind you can almost root for in hushed tones. She hides her youngest son, Zeus, in a cave on Crete, tricking Cronus with a stone swaddled in cloth, and the Titan King, smug in his ignorance, gulps it down, sealing his own fate without realizing it. But pause here, before Zeus grows up and launches his rebellion, because this is still the Age of Titans, a moment in cosmic history where the world is ruled not by the lightning bolt, but by raw, looming presence. An era that poets later romanticize as the Golden Age, when humans lived without toil, crops sprang without sowing, and death came gently, like sleep. Whether or not you believe that, you can almost feel the lull in the air. A deceptive peace stretching across fields that haven't yet been scarred by war. as if the earth itself sighs between storms. Yet, even here quirks surface. Ancient storytellers loved to insist that Cronus once ruled as a benevolent king in Italy after his fall, teaching agriculture to mortals, a cultural memory that gave rise to the festival of Saturnalia, where Romans basically invented the prototype for holiday. Parties, feasting, gift-giving, role reversals, and general chaos. So next time you unwrap a present in December, remember, you're honoring the Titan who once swallowed his own kids. And as you let that absurdity sink in, you notice the pattern forming. Creation, suppression, rebellion, repetition, each generation birthing the seeds of its own undoing. The story looping like a spiral rather than a straight line. You feel drowsy in the rhythm of it. The way the Titans stand like shadows in the twilight of the world. Their stories half forgotten, but their presence undeniable. And you realize you're only on the cusp of something far larger, because soon Zeus will rise, the Olympians will fight, and the cycle will churn again. But for now, you linger in the glow of the Titans' uneasy reign, their voices rumbling like distant thunder, their eyes flickering like fading stars, the air heavy with prophecy and dread, and you sink deeper into the hush, waiting for the storm you already know is coming. You barely have time to let the uneasy hush of the Titan's reign settle before you're swept deeper into Cronus' story. The Titan who became king after overthrowing his father, and now you see him sitting upon a throne carved from living stone. The air around him charged with both triumph and dread. Because even though poets later like to paint this period as the Golden Age, you can already sense the cracks forming beneath the glittering surface. The kind of cracks that tell you paradise is never as smooth as the brochure promised. Still, to mortals who will later sing of it, this was an age where men walked the earth free from labor. Crops burst forth without plows, and the air itself seemed to hum with contentment. A dreamlike world where death was gentle, more like drifting into sleep than being torn away. And you can imagine yourself lying in that sunlit field, lulled by the idea that time had slowed down enough to let you rest forever. Yet for Cronus, peace was an illusion, because no matter how golden the age appeared, he knew the prophecy whispered at his birth, just as he had risen against Uranus. One of his children would rise against him, and so you watch paranoia grip him like a tightening coil, his hand hovering over every cradle, his eyes sharp with suspicion, until, with monstrous decisiveness, he swallows each newborn whole, first Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon, his throat working like a cavernous prison, each child plunging into his belly where they remain alive, conscious, and trapped in darkness. You imagine what that must feel like, existing in perpetual confinement, hearing your siblings but unable to move. A nightmarish womb that never ends, and you realize that Cronus is both father and warden. His body a twisted Olympus where no one is free, and yet outside, the world still blooms with the ease of the Golden Age, as if mocking the secret horror festering in its ruler's chest. Rhea, his sister and queen, watches with silent rage, her heart splintering each time another child disappears, and she begins to plot with Gaia, their mother, who whispers strategies in her ear, because mothers in Greek myths are never just background characters. They are the axis around which revolutions turn, and so Rhea sets her plan into motion, determined that the next child, the sixth, will not share the same fate. When the time comes, she flees to Crete, her footsteps muffled against the soil, and in the hidden cave of Mount Ida, she gives birth to Zeus, the child destined to end the Titan's reign. She swaddles a stone in cloth and hands it to Cronus, who gulps it down without suspicion, thinking himself secure, while the baby is spirited away to safety, raised by nymphs, guarded by the curates, warriors who clash their shields and spears in thunderous rhythms to drown out his cries, a lullaby of war so that his father never hears the truth. You crouch in the shadows of that cave, watching the infant Zeus suckle honey and goat's milk, his small fists gripping the air as if already clutching lightning, and you wonder how much of destiny is choice, how much is inheritance, because even in his cradle he radiates the inevitability of revolt. Meanwhile, Cronus continues his rule, presiding over a world of ease that poets later remembered fondly. But you can't unsee the paranoia lacing every feast, every decree, his laughter forced, his gaze darting to Rhea with suspicion, while inside his body, his swallowed children murmur in the dark, voices echoing like restless ghosts. Historians still argue whether the Golden Age was ever imagined as a literal past or just a mythological ideal, a contrast to the toil and suffering of human life in later ages. But either way, the irony of calling Cronus' reign golden, while his children rotted inside him, never escapes you. And there's a quirky tidbit that makes you smile through the horror. The Romans later rebranded Cronus as Saturn and claimed that after his defeat, he fled to Italy and ruled peacefully, teaching agriculture and civilization, a reputation so positive that the Saturnalia festival became a week of wild joy masters serving slaves, gifts exchanged, tables overflowing, basically the ancient prototype for Christmas. Which means every time you hang a bauble on a tree, you're echoing the memory of a titan who swallowed his own kids. But before that ironic rehabilitation, you stand here in the shadow of his paranoia, watching Zeus grow in secret, his body strengthening, his mind sharpening, until the day Gaia and Rhea guide him to confront his father, disguised as a cupbearer. Zeus serves Cronus a potion that forces him to vomit, and in a grotesque cascade, out tumble the swallowed gods first, the stone clattering across the floor, then Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, alive and furious, their eyes blazing as if centuries of darkness have condensed into pure fire. Imagine the relief of that moment. Siblings reunited, their bodies still damped from the prison of their father's stomach, and the realization that they are no longer helpless infants, but gods in their own, right ready to rise against the one who devoured them. And yet, before we race ahead into the war that follows, you pause to feel the weight of this transition, the shift from Titans to Olympians. The end of the so-called Golden Age, because what lies ahead is not peace, but conflict, not abundance, but war. And you sense the cycle tightening again, a son rising against his father, a prophecy fulfilled, the wheel turning inescapably forward. The Golden Age, for all its shimmering allure, was never meant to last, and maybe that's the lesson that lingers as you drift toward sleep. The realization that even in myth, paradise carries shadows, that every golden moment contains the seed of its own undoing, and that power, no matter how brilliantly it shines, is always borrowed, never permanent, always one rebellion away from collapse. You slip deeper into the rhythm of inevitability, watching as Zeus, no longer the hidden child in a cave, but now a towering young god, armed with cunning and raw energy, begins to position himself for the revolt that everyone knows is coming, though few dare to say aloud, because in Greek mythology, revolutions don't sneak, they thunder, and you're there as the thunder starts to rumble, Zeus has freed his siblings from the prison of Cronus' belly, and you can feel their collective fury simmer like molten rock, each one carrying centuries of swallowed frustration, literally. And now, their bond is not just sibling affection, but forged steel. A unity born of shared imprisonment. The kind of unity you don't want to stand against if you're Cronus. The air feels thick, heavy with prophecy, and you can almost hear Gaia's voice whispering. The sun will overthrow the father, her words curling around the mountains like smoke as Zeus rallies his brothers and sisters, each of them vowing to fight, not only for vengeance, but for a new order, where the cycle of devouring might finally end or at least restart in a shinier, more dramatic way. You watch Poseidon heft his trident, its prongs shimmering with the promise of seas that will someday rage and soothe at his command. While Hades stands quiet but intense, his eyes dark pools that already seem to see into the underworld. He will rule, and Hera, Demeter, and Hestia gather around Zeus, their voices sharp, their anger steady, determined to never again be silenced by a father's hunger. Cronus, of course, doesn't sit idly, because Titans never give up thrones without a fight. He rallies his siblings, calling upon the might of Oceanus, Hyperion, and the others. The air crackling as ancient powers prepare to clash, and you realize you're standing on the brink of something colossal, something mythic in scale that will echo across centuries of storytelling. The Olympian revolt. Historians still argue whether these myths were born purely as metaphor for natural cycle storms, overthrowing skies, seasons replacing each other, or whether they carried a deeper social commentary, perhaps a reflection of human society's wrestling with the shift from older, more primal religious orders to new structured pantheons. But either way, you feel the tension in your bones. Because this isn't just family drama anymore, it's cosmic warfare waiting to erupt. Zeus begins his campaign with strategy rather than brute force, and that alone sets him apart from Cronus. Instead of leaning solely on strength, he seeks allies descending into Tartarus to release the imprisoned Cyclopes and Hecatonchires, those monstrous children Uranus had once feared so much. And in an act of generosity rare among gods, he offers them freedom in exchange for loyalty, and loyalty they give gladly, crafting for him the thunderbolts that will become his signature weapon. Lightning forged, not just as spectacle, but as a symbol of authority. While Poseidon receives his trident, and Hades a helm of invisibility, gifts that tilt the balance of power forever. You can almost see the sparks flying as the Cyclopeus hammer metal in the heart of the earth, the clang echoing like war drums. And you smirk at the quirky tidbit that some ancient writers claimed thunder was literally the sound of those Cyclopeas at work, hammering endlessly in their underground forges. Every time you hear a storm roll in, and so with weapons in hand and alliances forged, the Olympians march to confront Cronus, their footsteps shaking the ground, their voices. A chorus of rebellion that the sky itself seems to amplify. While Cronus and the Titans gather on the other side, their towering forms bristling with raw ancient strength. The battlefield stretching between them like a wound about to split open. You stand in that space, the silence before the storm, and you feel the inevitability pressing down. This is the revolt. The Olympians rising, the old order about to be shattered. When the clash finally erupts, it's not a single battle, but the beginning of a war. The Titanomachy, a struggle that will last 10 years and redraw the map of the cosmos. But this first confrontation, this revolt, is where the spark is struck, where Zeus hurls his first thunderbolt, the sky splitting open with light, the sound deafening, as it crashes against Cronus' sickle, sparks flying into the night, and you realize you're watching not just a fight, but a generational handover. Brutal, messy, and inevitable. You catch Cronus' expression as he meets his son's eyes, and for a flicker of a moment you almost see regret, as if he knows he set this in motion the moment he swallowed his children. As if he realizes too late that paranoia breeds rebellion, and rebellion breeds ruin. The Titans fight with the weight of age, their power raw but sluggish, like ancient mountains uprooted and hurled into combat, while the Olympians move with the sharpness of youth, their weapons gleaming, their fury fresh, and you sense the tide turning even as the battle rages. Scholars still argue whether this story reflects real historical memory of younger cultures, supplanting older ones Indo-European deities, overtaking earlier Mediterranean gods, or whether it's purely poetic invention. But either way, in this moment you don't care about academic debates, because the ground is shaking, the sky is on fire, and Zeus is shouting his defiance in a voice that rattles your ribs. And yet beneath the violence, you hear something almost like a lullaby. The rhythm of cycles, the certainty that no throne lasts forever, that sons rise, fathers fall, and the wheel keeps turning. And maybe that's why this story still soothes you as you drift into sleep, because it reminds you that nothing, no fear, no tyrant, no storm can last forever. Still, you linger a little longer, watching as the Olympians and Titans pull back from the first great clash, their armies bloodied but unbroken. The war far from over, but the revolt unmistakably underway. The old order shaken, the new one rising, and in the flicker of Zeus' thunderbolt, you see the future Olympus towering above the world, mortals praying to gods who once fought their own parents. And you realize you're only at the beginning of the story, with the real storm still waiting just beyond the horizon. You find yourself standing at the edge of a battlefield that seems to stretch forever, a place where mountains are torn from their roots and hurled, like stones where rivers boil and forests ignite under the sheer weight of divine fury. Because the Machi, the war between the Titans and the Olympians, has begun. And if you thought the revolt was intense, this is the part of the myth that makes you wonder how the Greeks ever slept at night after telling it. On one side, Cronus and the elder Titans, their bodies towering, their voices like avalanches, wielding ancient strength that comes from being the firstborn of earth and sky. And on the other, Zeus and his siblings, younger but sharper, their new weapons gleaming with terrifying precision, their eyes burning with both vengeance and the arrogance of destiny. For they are certain they will win, even if it takes eternity. The clash is deafening, thunderbolts slicing the air as Zeus hurls them with practiced fury, each one splitting the sky and searing the ground. Poseidon raising seas high enough to swallow valleys, waves crashing over Titan strongholds, Hades slipping through shadows with his helm of invisibility, striking unseen and retreating into darkness, while Hera, Demeter, and Hestia lend their powers to sustain the fight, their presence, a steady anchor for the younger gods who rally around them. The Cyclopes, grateful for their freedom, forge fresh weapons and secret forges their hammers, echoing underground like the heartbeat of the war, while the Hecatonchires finally unleash their full horror. 100 hands, each hurling stones and boulders so fast that they rain down like a storm of mountains, crushing Titans under the sheer weight of fury. You can almost hear the screams of the battlefield as immortals clash in a war that is not measured in days or months, but in decades, 10 long years of relentless struggle, neither side yielding the earth itself, trembling as though it might split apart from the strain. Historians still argue whether the Titanomachy was meant to reflect some distant cultural memory of invading tribes, displacing older peoples, or whether it was a purely symbolic tale about the inevitability of change, of new generations replacing old. But as you stand in this chaos, the interpretation doesn't matter. The ground shakes under your feet, mountains crumble, rivers run red, with cosmic ichor, and the stars themselves flicker as if watching nervously from above. A quirky tidbit lingers here. Some storytellers claim that Mount Othrys, the Titan stronghold, and Mount Olympus, the Olympians' rising home, weren't just symbolic bases, but actual mountains Greeks could point to. So travelers centuries later would look at those landscapes and imagine, right there is where Zeus threw his bolt, treating geography like a scar left behind by myth. The battles rage with a rhythm that almost lulls you, despite their violence. Thunder waves, shadows, fire, stone, over and over again. A cycle of assaults and retreats, of titans rallying with Cronus at their helm, sickle flashing like a crescent moon dipped in blood, while Zeus and his siblings press forward, their weapons sharper, their will unbroken, fueled by the certainty that prophecy is on their side. And yet, there are moments of doubt. You see Zeus falter after a particularly brutal clash, his chest heaving, his eyes narrowing as he wonders whether 10 years of war will end in anything but ruin, whether prophecy alone is enough to carry him. And in those moments, you feel the humanity of these gods, their weariness, their fear, even though they are immortal, because endless war drains even eternity. But Gaia, ever the schemer, whispers to Zeus of the true path to victory. He must rely fully on the Hecatonchirus, unleash them completely. For their 100 hands, though monstrous, are the key to overwhelming the Titans, who cannot match such sheer chaos. And so, Zeus listens, rallying them in the final stretch of war, promising them a place in the new order if they help him win. When the decisive battle finally comes, it is unlike anything you've yet seen. The Titans pouring all their might into a last, desperate stand. Cronus roaring his defiance as he swings his sickle against Zeus bolts, sparks and flames lighting the sky like a second sun. The Olympians pressing forward with every ounce of rage they've stored since their imprisonment, and the Hecatonchirus unleashing a storm of stones so vast that the Titans are buried beneath an avalanche of destruction. Pinned, broken, and finally subdued. The earth shudders as the war ends. The Titans defeated, their cries echoing into silence as Zeus chains them and casts them into Tartarus, the pit deeper than death itself, guarded by the very Hecatonchires who sealed their doom, the jailers becoming symbols of both fear and justice. You look into that abyss and almost feel sorry for them, the once proud rulers of the cosmos now consigned to endless darkness, their reign erased in favor of the new gods who will build their throne on Olympus, shining above the world. And yet, even as Zeus claims victory, you sense the cycle hasn't ended, only reset, because every ruler eventually falls. Every prophecy eventually returns, and though the Olympians stand triumphant, now their own children will one day rise, their own mistakes, birthing revolutions yet to come. Still, in this moment, the battlefield is quiet, the dust settling the rivers, calming the thunder, fading into soft rumbles, and you feel the weight of history settle into place. The Titans are gone, the Olympians victorious, and the world has shifted forever. Scholars still debate whether the Titanomachy was intended as a cautionary tale about hubris, about the dangers of clinging to power too tightly, or simply as an epic metaphor for natural order emerging from chaos. But as you drift in this silence, you don't need to choose an interpretation. The imagery itself is enough. The mountains split the seas, raging the sky, torn by lightning, and the earth exhaling in relief as the war finally ends. And maybe that's the detail that lingers as your eyes grow heavy. Not just the violence or the victory, but the sense of inevitability. The realization that even gods live in cycles, that no throne is eternal, and that even after the loudest war, the world eventually grows quiet again. The silence after the Titanomachi doesn't last long, because in Greek mythology, victory is never the end. It is only the prelude to the next calamity. And as you stand beside Zeus, surveying his new dominion, you can almost feel the rumble of rebellion stirring again. Not from the Titans, this time they're sealed deep in Tartarus. Their cries muffled by layers of darkness, but from an entirely new force rising from Gaia herself. For the earth is not done birthing children, and she is furious at how her older offspring have been treated. So she calls forth the giants, towering figures of brute strength, wild hair tangled with snakes, their feet planted firmly in the soil, as though each step could fracture the land. And this is the Gigantomachy, the war of the giants, another cosmic clash that hurls you straight into the heart of chaos, where every horizon is filled with monstrous shadows and every mountain trembles, as though it too fears what's coming. You watch the giants rise one by one, their eyes blazing, their hands clutching trees they've ripped from the ground to use as clubs. Their voices a thunderous growl that makes your bones vibrate, and you realize this isn't just a rebellion of power, it's a rebellion of nature itself. Gaia unleashing her rage against the Olympians who chained her beloved Titans, because even mothers with infinite patience eventually snap. Zeus, ever ready, rallies his siblings again, but this time there's a catch. Prophecy whispers that the gods cannot win this war alone. They will need the aid of a mortal, a strange twist that forces you to reconsider the hierarchy of the cosmos. For in a myth where immortals throw mountains like pebbles, the fate of Olympus suddenly hinges on fragile humanity. Enter Heracles, son of Zeus, an immortal woman, the hero, whose strength is already legendary, even in youth, destined to be the wild card that tips the balance. Because only with mortal blood can the giants be slain completely, their immortal bodies too resilient for divine force alone. You imagine Zeus grinding his teeth at the irony of needing help from a being he once thought of as an afterthought, and yet here, Heracles stands bow-taught arrows blazing with celestial fire, the mortal among immortals, who will carve victory where divine hands alone cannot. The battle erupts across plains and mountains, each clash a cacophony of stone and thunder. Zeus hurling his bolts so fast that the sky looks like a strobe light. Poseidon sending tidal waves that crash over armies of giants, drowning those too slow to climb. Athena smashing skulls with her shield and spear, her strategy sharp enough to match brute force, while Heracles picks them off one by one, his arrows finding hearts that gods alone could not pierce. And you realize you're watching something new, the intertwining of mortal and immortal destinies. A theme that will echo again and again in myths to come. Historians still argue whether the Gigantomachy was an older story grafted onto the Olympians' rise or a later invention meant to glorify Athens after all. Athenians loved to paint this battle on their temples, especially on the Parthenon, as if to say, see, even the gods needed heroes, and heroes look suspiciously like us. But as you stand in the middle of it, You don't care about political propaganda. You're just trying to keep your head down while boulders the size of villages hurtle overhead. A quirky tidbit surfaces here. Some ancient vase painters depicted the giants not as terrifying monsters, but as almost comical figures with leafy crowns and clumsy poses, suggesting that by the time those artists lived, the terror had softened into humor, the way modern cartoons turn once frightening villains into cuddly mascots. Though, if you were actually here, trust me, there'd be nothing funny about the way the ground splits under their charge. You look across the battlefield and see Alcyoneus, the mightiest of the giants, rising taller than the hills, his body shimmering with a kind of immortal invulnerability tied to the very soil he stands on. Arrows bounce off him, spears shatter, even Zeus bolts seem to fizzle against his skin, until Heracles, guided by Athena, drags him away from his homeland. His feet pulled from the nurturing earth, and once uprooted, the hero's arrows finally find their mark, the giant collapsing with a roar that echoes for miles. One by one, the other giants fall, Porphyrion struck down as he lunges for Hera. His lust turned to weakness when Zeus' bolt and Heracles' shaft hit him simultaneously. Enceladus crushed under a mountain, hurled by Athena, which legend says still smolders as Mount Etna in Sicily. Its volcanic eruptions, the giant's fiery breath leaking from beneath the stone. A myth so enduring that even today, locals point at the volcano and murmur of Enceladus' restless turning. You realize with awe how myths and landscapes entwine every ridge and eruption, explained not by geology, but by the scars of war between gods and monsters, and you can't help but smile at the cleverness of it. The way mythology becomes a map for the earth itself. The battle rages until the last of the giants lie fallen, their corpses scattered across the land, their roars fading into silence. And at last, the Olympians stand victorious again, their reign solidified not just by defeating their fathers, but by conquering the rebellious children of Earth itself. A second consolidation of power that makes Olympus unshakable for now. But you can't ignore the lingering unease, the sense that this pattern is endless. Rebellion, victory, consolidation, and the promise of future rebellion waiting just over the horizon. For Greek mythology never truly lets its gods rest, always dangling the thread of challenge, because power, once tasted, is always contested. As the Olympians celebrate, you notice Zeus glancing over his shoulder at the horizon, as if wondering what force Gaia might unleash next. Because if there's one thing you've learned by now, it's that mothers in myth never forgive, not fully, and the earth itself always keeps score. Scholars still debate whether the Gigantomachy was meant to be told alongside the Titanomachy or as a separate sequel story, but either way, its function is clear. To remind you that victory is never permanent, that power is fragile, even for gods, and that the line between mortal and immortal is blurrier than anyone likes to admit. And maybe that's why this story endures, why temples and vases and bedtime. Whispers kept retelling it because it reassures and unsettles in equal measure, promising that even giants can fall, but also warning that the ground beneath your feet might rebel at any moment. You take one last look at the battlefield, the air heavy with smoke and silence, the Olympians triumphant but wary, Heracles' bow still warm in his hands, the earth itself scarred with the weight of what just happened, and you drift away your eyelids. Heavy your breath, slowing, carrying with you the image of giants buried beneath mountains. They're restless, turning disguised as volcanoes, their roars muted, but never entirely gone. You barely have time to catch your breath from the last clash before the cosmos decides to up the stakes yet again. Because if the Titanomachi and the Gigantamachi weren't enough to keep you awake tonight, along comes Typhon, a monster so vast, so absurdly terrifying, that every story about him sounds like an ancient fever dream. And you, poor listener, are once again right there in the middle of it, craning your neck upwards until it hurts. Because this creature is taller than mountains, taller than storm clouds, a being stitched together from every nightmare the Greeks could imagine. And when you picture him, you realize you're not staring at a simple beast, but at the physical embodiment of cosmic chaos pushing back against order. Typhon, son of Gaia and Tartarus, is the last and greatest weapon the earth unleashes against the Olympians. And he makes 100-handed giants look like cranky toddlers throwing a tantrum. His body is a human shape, but scaled up to impossible proportions, his arms stretching from horizon to horizon, his legs rooted like tree trunks in the deepest seas, his shoulders crowned with writhing serpents instead of hair, his fingers tipped with claws sharp enough to carve valleys into stone, and from his eyes flash fire hot enough to sear your face, even as you hover far away, trying not to inhale smoke that smells like burning copper. Some stories say his entire lower body was a coiling mass of vipers, hissing and biting at anything that came near. And when he spoke, it wasn't really words, but a cacophony of every animal noise you've ever heard: lion roars, dog barks, serpent hisses, bull bellows, slayered so thick that it must have felt like standing inside a living thunderstorm. A quirky tidbit tucked into some retellings says that Typhon was so tall his head brushed the stars, and flames licked from his mouth all the way up to scorch the heavens. Which, if you take it literally, would mean the cosmos smelled faintly of charbroiled constellations for centuries afterward. Though that's probably poetic exaggeration, unless you like the idea of Orion's belt doubling as a barbecue pit. You watch as Zeus rallies the Olympians again, his hand tightening on the thunderbolts that by now feel like an extension of his body. And you can sense his frustration. First titans, then giants, now this absurd abomination. It's like the universe refuses to let him enjoy a peaceful reign. And maybe that's the whole point of these myths. Stability is always an illusion, because chaos is never gone. It's just waiting for the right moment to crawl back up. The battle begins in a frenzy, Zeus hurling bolts with such fury the sky cracks open like glass, Poseidon whipping the seas into walls of water to slow the monster's advance, Athena barking orders with soldiers' precision, Apollo loosing arrows of blinding light that spark against Typhon's scales. But none of it seems to matter. Typhon keeps coming, relentless, a juggernaut of earth and fire and storm, his massive hands ripping mountains from their roots and flinging them like skipping stones, his voice shaking the marrow of your bones until you feel like your body might just crumble into dust from sheer vibration. Historians still argue whether Typhon was an imported idea from Eastern mythologies. Some see echoes of Mesopotamian chaos dragons, like Tiamat in his More Weather. He was purely a Greek invention, the final embodiment of Gaia's resentment given monstrous shape. But whatever his origin, standing here now, you don't really care. You just know Hay's the kind of enemy you don't want to meet in a dark alley, or really anywhere. The fight turns desperate when Typhon manages the unthinkable. He actually overpowers Zeus, ripping the thunderbolts from his grasp, slicing the sinews of his hands and feet, so that the king of the gods collapses in agony, His power drained his body, trapped beneath Typhon's looming shadow. Imagine the horror of Olympus, their leader chained, their hope extinguished, the air thick with the smell of defeat. Some versions even say Typhon locked Zeus away in a cave guarded by serpent-bodied monsters, and the other gods fled in terror, disguising themselves as animals to hide. Among mortals, Hera as a cow, Apollo as a raven, Hermes as a goat-like children hiding from a storm too big to face. And here is a quirky image for you. Imagine the mightiest gods of myth scurrying around in barnyard disguises, mooing and bleeding, while Typhon stomps across Greece, turning valleys to craters and rivers to steam a scene. So absurd, it almost undermines the terror, and yet it underscores how close the cosmos came to unraveling. But then comes the twist, the comeback you didn't see coming. Hermes and pan-gods, often treated as mischief makers more than warriors, sneak into Typhon's lair and steal back Zeus' severed sinews, restoring his strength. A detail that always makes you chuckle, because it feels like the ancient version of a heist film. Two underdog tricksters pulling off the impossible, while the big guy regains his mojo. Rejuvenated, Zeus erupts from the cave with renewed fury, summoning storms that shake the cosmos, hurling bolt after bolt at Typhon until the monster stumbles, his body scorched, his snakehead shrieking in agony. The chase drives Typhon westward across seas and lands until Zeus finally pins him beneath Mount Etna in Sicily, the great volcano that even now spews fire and ash. And you realize this is more than a story. It's a myth etched into the landscape, a living reminder that Typhon still rides beneath the earth, his breath, the lava that streaks the sky, his roars, the earthquakes that rattle villages. A mainstream historical fact you might appreciate. Ancient Greeks genuinely believed volcanic eruptions were proof of Typhon's imprisonment, a way to explain natural disasters without modern geology, and locals prayed to Zeus for protection whenever Etna flared, treating mythology as both religion and seismology rolled into one. You take a moment to absorb the symbolisms, victorious not just over titans or giants, but over the very embodiment of chaos itself. An adversary so immense that defeating him seals Olympus' reign for good. It's the final act of consolidation, the moment order definitively triumphs over disorder. Though even here the story refuses to let you get too comfortable. Because if Typhon still writhes beneath the volcano, then chaos is never fully gone, just buried, waiting, biding its time. Scholars debate whether the Typhon myth was meant to parallel Near Eastern dragon-slaying epics, or whether it was a unique Greek meditation on the fragility of order. But either way, its message resonates. Power, even divine power, is only meaningful if it can survive its greatest test, and Zeus has finally passed his. You float above the smoldering crater, the air hot with sulfur, the ground trembling with Typhon's muted struggles, and you sense the gods above exhaling in relief. Their reign at last secured, though part of you can't help but smirk at how much trouble they've gone through just to keep their thrones, as if Olympus is less a palace and more a revolving door of crises. But as the smoke clears and the stars twinkle back into place, you find yourself lulled by the rhythm of it all. The rise of chaos, the struggle, the victory, the uneasy peace. And you know the story isn't done, because Greek mythology never lets you fall asleep without one more twist around the corner. You barely have time to feel the heat of Typhon's defeat, fading into the crust of Mount Etna, before another story pulls you closer. And this one isn't about gods slinging mountains at each other or thunderbolts tearing through the sky, but about something smaller. stranger, and closer to about the fragile, dangerous bond between mortals and immortals, and how one rebel god tipped the balance in favor of humankind, and how a single jar, yes, it's a jar, not a box, though everyone insists on calling it that, unleashed every misery you've ever known. You start with the figure of Prometheus, the titan who somehow managed to survive the wars, not because he was the biggest or the strongest, but because he was clever, a trickster, someone who saw angles others missed, and you find yourself walking beside him as he watches the newly formed humans shivering in the dark. No fire, no warmth, no cooked food, just huddled shapes crouching against the cold while the gods feast on Olympus. And you feel the ache of it, the injustice, the sense that maybe the universe really is rigged against the fragile little creatures meant to worship the divine. Prometheus decides he's not having it, that he will steal fire itself and place it in the hands of mortals. And you can almost hear the mischievous snicker as he smuggles a glowing ember inside a hollow fennel stalk, hiding divine flame in the most ordinary object, a move so simple and so sly that you can't help but admire it. Like a magician palming a coin, and suddenly humanity is transformed. Fire flickers in caves, smoke curls into the night sky. Meat roasts, tools are forged, and humans begin stepping into their own power. A mainstream historical fact here. Archaeologists note that fire mastery dates back hundreds of thousands of years, long before written myth, and the Greeks, knowing its importance, wrapped the discovery in divine rebellion because they understood that fire wasn't just a tool. It was civilization itself, the line between beast and thinker. But Zeus, of course, isn't amused. The king of the gods looks down from Olympus, sees the smoke rising from human fires, and feels his authority undermined, his careful order insulted by the audacity of one titan, siding with mortals. His punishment is swift and brutal. Prometheus is chained to a remote cliff in the Caucasus Mountains, iron shackles biting into his flesh, his arms stretched wide against the rock, and every day an eagle, massive and merciless, descends to tear into his stomach and devour his liver. And every night, because immortals don't get to die, the organ regenerates only for the cycle to begin again. You shiver at the thought of it, this endless loop of agony. And yet you also sense the quiet satisfaction Prometheus must feel. He knows that even in chains, even in pain, his gift to humanity endures, that his rebellion cannot be undone, and there's something strangely comforting in that defiance. A quirky tidbit: some late retellings claim that the eagle was actually the pet of Zeus himself, which, if you picture it, means the king of the gods had essentially weaponized his own bird like an ancient drone, dispatching it daily to torment the titan. A petty little flourish that makes the punishment feel less like justice and more like divine pettiness. But Zeus isn't finished, because punishing Prometheus is only half the story. He also wants to punish humanity. Those ungrateful little upstarts who dared to enjoy fire. And so he hatches a plan, not of brute force, but of temptation. The kind that always gets mortals in trouble. He instructs Hephaestus, the divine smith, to mold the shape of a woman out of clay, sculpting her with such care that her form is flawless. And then he commands the other gods to contribute gifts. Beauty from Aphrodite, charm from Hermes' craftsmanship, from Athena music from Apollo, each layering power upon her until she becomes irresistible, and they name her Pandora, which means all gifted, though in truth the greatest gift she carries is also a curse. She is sent as a bride to Epimetheus, brother of Prometheus. And though Prometheus had warned him never to accept a gift from Zeus, Epimetheus can't resist, because when the gods hand you a partner sculpted from perfection, saying no feels almost impossible. And here comes the part everyone thinks they know. Pandora carries with her a jar, pithos in Greek mistranslated into box. Centuries later by Erasmus, but hey, Pandora's box has a better ring to it. Sealed and forbidden, and of course, curiosity gnaws at her, until one day she lifts the lid. Out spills not treasure, but every misery, imaginable disease, toil, pain, madness, famine, envy, death itself all, the shadows that now haunt humanity. And as you watch them rise, you can almost feel your own chest tighten, as though those ancient curses still slither through the world today, hidden in every doctor's waiting room, every sleepless night, every grudge that won't let go. But here's the strange grace note. When Pandora slams the jar shut in panic, one thing remains trapped inside, hoping those scholars still debate whether that was a blessing or another trick. Historians still argue whether hope was meant as comfort for humanity, or as yet another cruel, tease-dangling relief that never truly comes. The myth insists that hope is humanity's only shield against despair, and that small ember of optimism is what allows you to keep moving, even when everything else feels cursed. The story, as you drift through it, makes you reconsider the balance of gifts and punishments, rebellion and submission. Because without Prometheus' theft, you'd still be fumbling in the dark. But without Pandora's curiosity, you wouldn't understand why life feels like a constant struggle between joy and suffering. Some versions of the myth soften Pandora, portraying her not as malicious, but as innocent, manipulated by Zeus' scheme. Her curiosity, a natural extension of being human, rather than divine sabotage. And as you imagine her trembling fingers lifting the jar's lid, you can't help but sympathize after all. If someone gave you a mysterious sealed container and told you never to open it, wouldn't you itch to peek inside? A mainstream historical echo. The Greeks often used sealed jars to store grain, wine, and precious goods, and the image of Pandora opening one to unleash misfortune reflects the everyday fear of scarcity and spoilage. A reminder that your next meal could vanish in an instant. That fragility wasn't just metaphorical, but painfully real. The punishment of Prometheus and the curse of Pandora together create a symmetry. One god gives humanity fire, the other gives them suffering, and between the two you find the strange paradox of human existence. You are both empowered and doomed, gifted with tools to build civilization, and cursed with the burdens that make you question why it matters. You lie there, dim light flickering on your ceiling like the first sparks stolen from Olympus, and you realize these myths aren't really about distant gods at all. They're about you, about your capacity to rebel, to suffer, to endure, to keep a fragile flame alive in the midst of endless night. And even as you feel the chains of Prometheus tighten around your own ribs, you can sense the warmth of that fire in your chest. A reminder that every act of creation, every story told, every light switched on in the darkness is a quiet defiance of Zeus himself. Proof that Prometheus' rebellion still burns, and that Pandora's jar, though terrible, never fully shut away your ability to hope. You barely have time to let the echoes of Pandora's jar fade before you feel the landscape around you shifting. The smoke of fire curling into images of mortals who step forward out of the haze. Taller, bolder, more daring than the fragile creatures you saw shivering in caves. Because now humanity has its champions, the first heroes, and you drift alongside them as if you're walking through the halls of some vast gallery. each figure larger than life, but still tragically human. And you realize that their stories form the bridge between the world of gods and the struggles of mortals. You begin with Perseus, son of Dano and Zeus, a hero born from impossible circumstances, because Zeus had slipped into Danae's chamber, not as a man, but as a shower of golden light, a strange and poetic way for the king of the gods to cheat fate, since Dano had been locked away by her paranoid father, King Acrisius, who had heard an oracle warn that his grandson would one day kill him, and thought he could outsmart destiny by sealing his daughter underground, which, if you think about it, is a very Greek king kind of move. Take a prophecy, try to beat it by doing something cruel and ridiculous, and still end up failing miserably. Perseus grows up with that quiet, divine glow about him, and when his mother's suitors mock and threaten him, he rashly boasts that he could fetch the head of Medusa herself, one of the Gorgons whose gaze turned men to stone. And suddenly, you find yourself following him across stormy seas and desolate wastelands, armed with gifts from the gods' Hermes winged sandals, Athena's polished shield, Hades' helmet of invisibility tools that sound like cheat codes in a video game but symbolize divine favor. And you watch him creep into the cave of the Gorgons, reflections glinting in the mirrored shield as he edges closer to Medusa, who sleeps among the writhing nest of snakes on her head, and with a single strike, he severs her head quick and decisive before fleeing with the prize tucked into a bag, while the other Gorgons shriek and chase him in vain. A quirky tidbit surfaces here. The blood dripping from Medusa's severed neck was said to give birth to Pegasus, the winged horse, as if even in death she could not help but spawn something miraculous, which makes you pause and wonder if the Greeks were telling you that even horrors can give rise to beauty. Perseus uses Medusa's head more than once, most famously to rescue Andromeda from a sea monster, and you picture the scene like a cinematic freeze frame. The hero swooping down, the chained maiden, the monster looming, and then, in one flash, stone overtakes the beast's eyes, its roar frozen forever, the damsel freed, and humanity witnesses its first great rescue story. But Perseus isn't alone in this gallery of first heroes. You also meet Bellerophon, another figure who straddles the line between blessed and cursed. He tames Pegasus with Athena's help, a dazzling act of harmony between mortal and divine. And he uses the winged horse to defeat the Chimera, a creature with the body of a lion, the head of a goat sprouting from its back, and a serpent for a tail, belching fire as it rampages through light. You ride with him in imagination, feeling the rush of air, the terror of flames, the improbable triumph as arrows rain down from above until the beast falls, proof that monsters, no matter how grotesque, could be overcome. But Bellerophon, unlike Perseus, grows arrogant, and that arrogance is his undoing, because he decides he deserves to ascend to Olympus itself, to ride Pegasus into the realm of the gods as though he belongs there. And Zeus, unimpressed with this mortal overstepping his place, sends a gadfly to sting Pegasus, who rears and throws Bellerophon back down to earth, where he lands crippled and humiliated, living out his days in bitterness, a warning about the fine line between courage and hubris. Historians still argue whether these stories of early heroes reflect folk, memories of real warrior chiefs, or whether they were allegories invented to dramatize the dangerous edges of human ambition. But either way, as you drift deeper, you realize they capture something essential: the need for humanity to imagine itself standing tall against monsters, both literal and metaphorical. You also meet Theseus, a figure who embodies cleverness and civic duty, He makes his way through the twisting labyrinth of Crete with the help of Ariadne's thread, unraveling it behind him so he can find his way back after slaying the Minotaur, that half-man, half-bull creature born of divine mischief and human folly. You picture the dark corridors, the stench of straw and blood, the low rumble of the beast waiting in the shadows, and the careful step-by-step following of the string proof that sometimes survival isn't about brute strength, but about wit, patience, and a little help from someone who cares enough to lend you a spool of thread. A mainstream historical fact slips in here. Archaeologists exploring Naissus in Crete have found the sprawling ruins of a palace with corridors and rooms so complex that early visitors thought it really was a labyrinth, suggesting the Minotaur myth may have grown from the awe and fear inspired by that architectural marvel. Theseus emerges as more than just a monster lair. He becomes a unifier, credited with bringing together the scattered villages of Attica into the single city of Athens, showing how myth doubles as political foundation, where heroes don't just fight beasts, but also build nations. And as you step back to take in the whole gallery of early heroes, you notice how their stories differ from the later, more famous epics. These are not yet the Trojan War legends or the tragedies of cursed houses. These are origin tales, raw experiments in what it means to be a hero, sometimes triumphant, sometimes doomed, always precariously balanced between divine favor and divine wrath. You sense how the Greeks were shaping templates, the resourceful slayer of monsters, the hubristic rider who flies too high, the clever wanderer who navigates traps, each archetype still echoing in every superhero movie or fantasy novel you've ever read. And you realize that the Greeks weren't just telling bedtime stories. They were mapping out the edges of human potential, sketching out the dangers of pride, the rewards of courage, and the inevitability of failure if you forget your place. You find yourself oddly comforted by these old tales, comforted because they remind you that struggle has always been the heart of the human experience, that every monster, whether it breathes fire or sits quietly in the corner of your mind, is there to be faced, sometimes slain, sometimes endured. And as the stories fade, you hold on to the quiet hum of a truth that has echoed for millennia. Heroes are not gods, but neither are they ordinary mortals. They are you stretched into myth, your fears and hopes, given faces, wings, and weapons, forever walking the line between triumph and tragedy. You barely catch your breath from wandering the labyrinth with Theseus when the air thickens again, the world around you reshaping into a golden glow that slowly sharpens into the glint of polished armor, the clash of spears, the heated whispers of gods leaning in close to mortals. And you know you're entering the great prelude to the Trojan War, a tapestry of tangled fates and divine rivalries that begins not on a battlefield, but in the quiet, dangerous realm of prophecy, vanity, and desire. It starts with a wedding feast. Strangely enough, the union of the mortal Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, who had once caught Zeus' wandering eye, until an oracle declared that any child she bore would surpass his father, a warning that even the king of the gods couldn't ignore. So he married her off to a human instead, thinking he had neatly sidestepped disaster. Though you already sense the irony of this supposed safety measure, because Thetis' son will be none other than Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age. But for now, the story lingers on that fateful wedding attended by gods, demigods, and kings, until a single uninvited guest slips in, Eris, goddess of strife, who tosses a golden apple inscribed with, "To the fairest," a move so petty and yet so catastrophic that it launches centuries of storytelling because instantly three goddesses lay claim to it. Hera, queen of Olympus; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and desire. They could have settled this sensibly, maybe asked Zeus to arbitrate. But Zeus, wisely knowing that no decision could end well, passes the choice to a mortal judge. And so your gaze shifts to a young Trojan shepherd on Mount Ida, Paris, who is handsome, thoughtful, and completely unprepared for the storm he is about to unleash. You hover beside him as the three goddesses arrive, shimmering in impossible beauty, each offering a bribe. Hera promises him kingship and power. Athena offers wisdom and invincibility in battle. And Aphrodite tempts him with the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Historians still argue whether the judgment of Paris was originally a myth to explain why the Trojans and Greeks clashed, or whether it was a symbolic allegory for the inevitable collision of desire, politics, and pride. But either way, you watch Paris falter, torn between duty and temptation, before handing the golden apple to Aphrodite, choosing love or perhaps lust over power and wisdom. A decision that seems romantic in the moment, but will drown his city in blood. Meanwhile, Helen herself lives across the Aegean, the daughter of Zeus and Leda, famously born either from an egg after Zeus seduced her mother in the form of a swan, or in some versions, simply raised as the mortal child of the Spartan royal family. But however she comes into the world, she grows into a woman whose beauty is described as so radiant it could bend the wills of kings. Though beauty in Greek myth is never a blessing without a curse, she is married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. But when Paris arrives as a guest, Aphrodite works her influence, and Helen falls in love or is carried away, depending on which version you believe, becoming the spark that ignites one of the most legendary wars in human memory. You drift along the halls of Sparta, seeing the moment Helen chooses Paris, whether out of desire or enchantment, and you feel the tremor of betrayal as she abandons her husband, her child, and her throne, boarding a ship that sails toward Troy under Aphrodite's unseen guidance. A quirky tidbit enters here. Some ancient sources insist that the real Helen never went to Troy at all, that the gods whisked her away to Egypt for safekeeping, and only a phantom Helen ever lived in Troy's walls, a theory that later writers like Euripides played with, showing just how slippery myth could be, as if the ancients themselves couldn't quite decide how much blame she deserved. Back in Sparta, Menelaus' rage is swift, but he isn't alone. The suitors who once courted Helen had sworn an oath years earlier, a pact designed by her cunning stepfather, Odysseus, who had cleverly made every suitor promise to defend Helen's chosen husband against any future insult. And now Menelaus calls in that oath, summoning the mightiest kings and warriors of Greece. Agamemnon of Mycenae, Menelaus' own brother, and the most powerful warlord of the age. Odysseus of Ithaca, the reluctant strategist who tries to feign madness to avoid the call to arms. Ajax the Greater, towering and nearly unbeatable in combat. Nestor of Pylos, the wise but aging counselor. And eventually Achilles himself, hidden at first by his mother, Thetis, who fears the prophecy that her son will die young if he goes to Troy, but who cannot stop fate from pulling him into the war. A mainstream historical fact slips in here. Archaeologists at Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey have unearthed layers of a great city that burned around the 12th century BCE, suggesting that behind the poetic grandeur of the Iliad There may have been a real conflict, remembered dimly in myth, possibly over trade routes, land, or political rivalry, rather than a single runaway bride. Still, in myth, it is Helen's face that launched 1,000 ships, and you can almost hear the thunder of oars as the Greek fleet gathers, sails unfurling in the wind, bronze helmets flashing under the sun, each warrior carrying not just weapons, but the weight of pride, loyalty, and divine manipulation. For the gods themselves are already choosing sides. Hera and Athena, furious at Paris' judgment, throw their support behind the Greeks, while Aphrodite, of course, protects Paris and Troy, and Zeus, as always, pretends neutrality, but secretly tilts events according to his whims. You feel the anticipation building like a storm about to break, and you realize this is not just a war for a woman, but a cosmic chess match with gods moving mortals as pawns, each battle already scripted by divine egos and old grudges. Yet the beauty of the myth is how human it feels. The jealous husband, the runaway lovers, the bonds of oaths and honor, the impossibility of avoiding war once too much pride has been staked. You find yourself almost pitying the Trojans, who accept Helen and Paris into their walls, sealing their fate, while across the sea the Greeks prepare to embark, driven by a mixture of loyalty and ambition, knowing full well that many of them will never return. The story, even before a single spear is thrown, is already soaked in tragedy, because you can sense that no one, neither Helen, nor Paris, nor Menelaus, nor Agamemnon, nor even the meddling gods will truly win, and yet still they march. Because in Greek myth, fate is not a thread you can cut, but a rope dragging you forward, no matter how much you dig your heels into the ground. And so, as the sails rise and the horizon darkens with storm clouds conjured by divine hands, you drift quietly among them, the soft creak of ropes and the slap of waves like a lullaby, knowing that the world has now shifted irreversibly, and that soon the beaches of Troy will be littered with bodies and legends alike. You barely have time to steady yourself on the creaking Greek decks before the salty wind whips harder, carrying you across the Aegean straight into the heart of the Trojan plains, where 10 years of blood, pride, and divine meddling are about to unfurl. And you can almost taste the metallic temps of iron in the air as the armies clash, thousands of warriors surging against Troy's high walls. Yet before you see the first spear fly, you already feel the heavy presence of gods leaning over the battlefield, whispering to their champions, tugging at destinies like puppeteers who can't resist showing off their favorite marionettes. And this is where the myth plunges into one of its richest and most human layers, the tension between mortal valor and divine interference. Because on one hand you watch seasoned fighters clashing in brutal combat, sweat and dust coating their bronze armor, while on the other hand you hear Hera scheming, Athena whispering strategies, Apollo hurling plagues, and Aphrodite rushing onto the field to shield Paris from certain death, dragging him away under a mist just as Menelaus raises his sword for the kill, a moment that makes you mutter in irritation, because this war, meant to avenge Helen's abduction, is constantly skewed by gods too invested in their grudges. You trudge through the first years of the war, where the Greeks raid the Trojan countryside but cannot breach the walls, where the Trojans, under the stalwart leadership of Hector, son of Priam, hold their ground with remarkable resilience, and you see the war devolve into a grinding stalemate. Not unlike many real sieges recorded in history, such as the protracted wars around Bronze Age cities in Anatolia, where archaeologists have found charred remains and weapons embedded in the rubble. A sobering reminder that beneath the poetry of Homer, there were real human screams and real smoldering ruins. Yet within the mythic frame, what catches your sleepy attention most are the personal stories weaving through the grand conflict. Achilles, soaking in his tent after a quarrel with Agamemnon over the captive Briseis, refusing to fight while the Greek army falters without him. His rage simmering not just against Agamemnon, but against the very idea of being disrespected. For in his mind, honor is worth more than victory. Hector, the dutiful son and brother, torn between his love for his wife, Andromache, and his duty to defend Troy. A man who knows the prophecy that his city will fall but fights anyway, embodying that tragic nobility the Greeks admired. Odysseus, ever cunning, devising schemes to keep morale alive, such as sneaking into Troy disguised as a beggar to gather intelligence, showing you how the mind can be as sharp as a spear. And Ajax the Greater, towering like a storm cloud, so powerful that even when wounded, he still drags entire lines of Greeks back to safety, though his tragic fate lies waiting for him after the war. You drift closer into the heart of Homer's Iliad, hearing the poetic rhythm that once rang through oral tradition, a rhythm that lulls you even as the battles rage. And in this recitation, you witness the wrath of Achilles ignite when his closest companion, Patroclus, stands his armor and charges into battle, driving the Trojans back, but meeting his end at the hands of Hector. A death that snaps Achilles' pride like dry wood and replaces it with a grief so consuming that he re-enters the war, not for glory, but for vengeance, cutting through Trojan lines with a fury so terrifying that even the river Scamander rises in protest, swelling its waters to drown him. A surreal moment when nature itself resists human violence. Historians still argue whether Achilles and Patroclus were cousins, comrades, or lovers, debating the cultural nuances of Greek male companionship and the intense intimacy expressed in the epic. But whatever the label, the grief is palpable, and you feel it in your chest as Achilles hunts Hector down, chasing him around the walls of Troy 3 times before finally killing him, tying his body to his chariot and dragging it in the dust. A brutal gesture that horrifies even the gods, reminding you that even heroes lose themselves to rage. Yet in one of the Iliad's most moving moments, Priam, Hector's father, slips into the Greek camp under cover of night, kneels before Achilles, and kisses the hand that killed his son, begging for the body back. And you see Achilles, broken and human again, weep with him, 2 enemies sharing grief in the soft glow of the firelight. A reminder that beneath the grand war beats the simple, aching heart of family. Still, the war continues beyond Homer's epic, spilling into later cycles of myth where new faces join the fight. Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, leading her fierce warrior women to Troy's aid, only to be struck down by Achilles, who is said to have fallen in love with her beauty in the instant he killed her. Memnon, the Ethiopian king, whose armor gleams like the sunrise, and who duels Achilles with such ferocity that Zeus himself weighs their fates on golden scales before Memnon finally falls. And yet even Achilles cannot outrun prophecy, for though Thetis dipped him in the Styx as a child, making his body invulnerable, except for the heel she held, fate ensures that Paris, with Apollo guiding his arrow, strikes that very spot, and the greatest warrior of Greece crumples into the dust, leaving the Greeks without their mightiest champion. A quirky tidbit emerges here. In some versions, Achilles' bones are mixed with those of Patroclus, their ashes intermingled so completely that they can never be parted. A symbolic gesture that ancient audiences may have understood as a deep affirmation of their bond. Though whether romantic or fraternal scholars continue to debate, with Achilles gone, the war's momentum shifts, but the Greeks press on, bringing new champions into the fray. Ajax the Lesser, known for his cruelty, who commits sacrilege by dragging Cassandra, a prophetess of Troy, from Athena's temple, an act that seals his doom. Philoctetes, who wields the bow of Heracles, a weapon prophesied to be essential for Troy's downfall. And Neoptolemus, Achilles' own son, brought from Cyrus to continue his father's legacy with a mercilessness that even shocks seasoned warriors. You see the gods still meddling, their rivalries unresolved, with Hera and Athena determined to crush Troy, while Aphrodite shields Paris until his own fate arrives, and Zeus, distant as always, letting destiny run its course. Finally, Odysseus' cunning provides the decisive stroke. The Greeks pretend to retreat, leaving behind the massive wooden horse as an offering. And though Cassandra warns the Trojans not to trust it, her cursed prophecies fall on deaf ears, so the horse is wheeled inside, and at night, Greek soldiers climb out, opening the gates for their comrades, unleashing fire, slaughter, and the long-promised ruin of Troy. You wander the burning streets, feeling the heat and hearing the cries, watching Priam cut down at the altar, seeing Aeneas guided away by the gods to found new destinies in foreign lands, while Helen, whose face began it all, is either welcomed back by Menelaus or punished, depending on which version you choose to believe. Her beauty once again sparking debate, and as the smoke coils into the sky, you sense that this is not just the end of a city, but the birth of countless stories that will ripple across centuries. From Homer's epics to Roman poetry, from Renaissance paintings to modern films, each retelling adding new shades of meaning. Yet lying beneath the chaos is that quiet lull of inevitability, the whisper that no matter how fiercely men fight or how loudly gods shout, fate always has the final word, and you find yourself drifting into that stillness, as if the crash of spears and the wails of widows are receding into a dream, a half-remembered song echoing across the ages. You barely have time to wipe the ashes of Troy from your sandals before the winds snatch you again, hurling you into the salty spray of the open sea, where Odysseus, wily king of Ithaca, begins his long and winding voyage home, and the creak of his ship's timbers mixes with the groans of weary men who thought the war's end meant rest, not another decade of wandering. But you, floating among them, quickly sense that this is less a journey across water and more a passage through every corner of the human psyche, because every island, every storm, every monster is another mirror held up to your own endurance, cunning, and weakness. And as you lean against the mast, you feel the pull of nostalgia that gnaws at Odysseus, the ache for hearth and wife and son, even while the sea insists on tossing obstacle after obstacle before him. You first stumble onto the island of the Lotus Eaters, where the locals offer flowers so sweet that the crew forgets their homes, drifting into stupor, and you catch yourself thinking of how in every culture there are tales of substances that erase memory. Opium in the East, Soma in the Vedic Himsand. You wonder if Homer wasn't slyly warning against surrendering willpower to easy pleasures, because when Odysseus drags his men back to the ship, binding them to the benches, you sense the theme that will haunt this whole voyage. Survival requires not just strength, but the discipline to resist oblivion. Soon after, the Cyclops looms before you, Polyphemus, towering and grotesque, herding sheep in a cave that becomes a death trap, and you shrink back as he devours two of Odysseus' men, raw, crunching bones between his teeth, while Odysseus, resourceful as always, offers him strong wine and tricks him with the false name Nobody, blinding his single eye with a sharpened stake before sneaking the survivors out beneath the bellies of sheep. Yet in the flush of triumph, Odysseus shouts his real name, a boastful flaw that lets Polyphemus call upon his father Poseidon for vengeance. And you feel the sea god's anger crackling under the waves, like a gathering storm that will haunt every league of the voyage. Historians still argue whether stories of one-eyed giants came from ancient encounters with elephant skulls, whose central nasal cavity might have been mistaken for an eye socket, fueling myths of monstrous beings. And as you turn this over in your mind, the winds carry you next to Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who gives Odysseus a leather bag containing storms. But the crew, suspecting treasure, opens it just as Ithaca's shoreline peeks into view, blowing them back across the sea. Blunder so human it almost makes you laugh, for how many times has greed undone hard-won progress? From there, the crew stumbles into the land of the Lastrygonians, giants again, but crueler than the Cyclops, hurling boulders that smash ships and snatching sailors like fish, until only Odysseus' vessel remains, and you begin to notice how each trial pares down his company, whittling numbers until only the hardiest or luckiest survive, a grim pattern that echoes the reality of long-distance voyages in antiquity, where attrition through scurvy, storms, and raids left few alive at journey's end. Exhausted, you stagger into Circe's forested isle, where the enchantress turns men into pigs, their squeals piercing your ears. But Hermes lends Odysseus the herb moly to resist her spell, and instead of slaying her, Odysseus chooses persuasion, sharing her bed for a year, while his men lounge in forgetful ease. A choice that makes you frown, because here survival blurs with indulgence, and you realize the myth toys with questions of loyalty and desire. Yet a quirky tidbit reminds you that later medieval readers often misread Circe not as a witch, but as a metaphor for the temptations of the flesh, making her less a sorceress than a symbol of distraction from duty. When Odysseus finally leaves, he is told he must sail to the underworld, and so you shiver as the ship edges into the land of the dead, where shadows crowd the shore, and Odysseus, pouring libations of honey milk and blood, summons spirits to drink, among them the prophet Tiresias, who warns him of Poseidon's wrath and the dangers of Helios' cattle. And as you watch the shades flutter like moths around the offering, you catch sight of Achilles, now a ghost, who tells Odysseus he would rather be a living servant than a dead king, a sobering statement that slices through the grandeur of heroism, reminding you that glory fades, while life, however humble, is precious. From the mist rise more figures: his mother, who died of grief in his absence, Ajax, still bitter about losing Achilles' armor, and even Agamemnon, lamenting his murder at the hands of Clytemnestra. You notice how the epic folds personal tragedy into cosmic scale, binding private grief to public myth. Sailing onward, you grip the mast as the sirens' voices curl around you, honeyed and lethal, promising knowledge of all things, and you know the danger is real, because Odysseus, curious yet cautious, plugs his men's ears with wax, but binds himself to the mast, so he alone can listen, writhing against the ropes as the music claws at his soul. It feels eerily like a metaphor for the lure of forbidden knowledge irresistible, yet destructive, and historians still argue whether the siren's song represented the oral tradition itself, a dangerous but alluring art that could drown men in endless stories. Escaping you, face the narrow straits of Scylla and Charybdis, monsters of sea and rock. And though Odysseus steers closer to Scylla, losing 6 men to her snapping jaws, you shudder at the inevitability that sometimes survival means sacrifice, a principle as old as warfare and seafaring itself. At last, battered and frayed, the crew lands on Thranacha, where the cattle of Helios graze under divine protection. And though Odysseus warns his men not to touch them, hunger and desperation drive them to slaughter the sacred beasts, a mistake that seals their doom. For when they set sail again, Zeus smashes the ship with a thunderbolt, leaving Odysseus alone, clinging to driftwood, swept finally to the nymph Calypso's island. Here you watch years stretch like molasses, Calypso offering immortality if he stays, and though her cave hums with comfort, Odysseus' heart aches only for Penelope, the wife weaving and unraveling her loom back in Ithaca. And you sense in his refusal the core of his character, not just cunning, not just bravery, but an unshakable loyalty to his mortal life, rejecting eternity for the chance to return to his finite, fragile world. A quirky tidbit surfaces again. Later poets imagined Calypso literally means to conceal, suggesting that her island was not just a place, but a metaphor for stagnation, for the temptation to remain hidden from the flow of time. Eventually, the gods intervene, Hermes carrying Zeus' order that Calypso must let him go, and Odysseus sails once more, only to be shipwrecked again, washing up among the Phaeacians, where he recounts his whole tale, as if rehearsing it for the very first listeners of epic poetry. And you realize that this act of storytelling within the story is Homer's wink to you, showing how myth itself survives through retelling. When the Phaeacians finally ferry him home, Odysseus returns in disguise, finding his hall overrun by arrogant suitors who devour his wealth and court Penelope. And as he strings his great bow, firing an arrow clean through 12 axes, you feel a surge of tension snap into release, for the king has come home at last, revealing himself and cutting down the suitors in a storm of vengeance. Blood pooling across the tiles, while Penelope, wise and cautious, tests him one last time by speaking of their bed carved from a living olive tree. And when Odysseus responds with the secret only they share, recognition blossoms, and you finally breathe out, knowing the circle has closed. Yet still, scholars debate whether the Odyssey's ending was the original, with some suggesting the later episodes of restless wanderings at Ithaca were tacked on. A narrative seemed where oral tradition stretched too far, but whatever its textual history, the resonance remains. Odysseus' Odyssey is not just his, it is yours too. The endless push against storms, temptations, and monsters, always with the dim light of home glimmering at the horizon, urging you onward through the long dark night of the sea. You barely settle from the crashing waves of Odysseus' trials before the shadows shift again, and you find yourself walking not on seas or battlefields, but in the marble halls of mortal dynasties. Halls dripping with gold yet reeking of blood, because now you must face the house of Atreus, that infamous family cursed by crimes so old that each new generation is born already tangled in the snares of vengeance. And as you move through their story, you feel the weight of inevitability pressing on your chest, the sense that myth here, becomes less about gods flinging thunderbolts and more about the poisonous cycle of betrayal, murder, and retribution that mortals inflict on one another. It begins long before Agamemnon and Menelaus marched to Troy. It begins with Tantalus, grandfather of the line, who in a grotesque gesture of arrogance served the gods a feast that included the flesh of his own son. Pelops, just to test whether they could detect the deception. And though the gods restored Pelops to life, except for his missing shoulder, replaced with ivory, they cursed Tantalus and his descendants with an unending cycle of ruin. And you can almost hear the whisper of historians still arguing whether this myth sprang from ancient taboos against human sacrifice, echoing in distorted form through the ages. Pelops himself, reborn but already carrying the stain of his father's hubris, desired Hippodamia, whose father, King Enemos, challenged every suitor to a deadly chariot race, killing them when they lost, until Pelops, with the aid of Poseidonor in another version, through bribing Enemos, charioteer sabotaged the king's wheels, killing him and winning Hippodamia, but betraying the charioteer in the process, throwing him into the sea, where, with his dying breath, he cursed Pelops and his house. You notice how curses stack here like stones, each betrayal layering over the last, until the family resembles less a noble lineage and more a quarry of jagged rocks ready to fall. From Pelops are born Atreus and Thyestes' brothers, locked in bitter rivalry, and you shiver as Atreus, after being betrayed, cooks Thyestes' sons and serves them to their father in a gruesome banquet, a scene so grotesque that even centuries later Roman tragedians lingered on its horror, staging the tale as theater for audiences who both recoiled and reveled in the extremity of human cruelty. And here you remember a quirky tidbit that archaeologists once unearthed: Mycenaean banqueting halls in the Peloponnese filled with animal bones and charred remains, making some scholars wonder if the myth of cannibalistic feasts reflected real anxieties about ritual dining gone wrong. From this feast emerges Aegisthus, Thyestes' surviving son, raised in secrecy, destined to strike Atreus' line in revenge. And so the cycle turns again, preparing the stage for Agamemnon, leader of the Greeks at Troy, who carries the curse like a hereditary disease. You recall how before Troy Agamemnon offends Artemis by boasting too loudly or killing a sacred deer. Historians still argue whether this reflects actual priestly rituals of appeasement before sailing, and the goddess stalls the winds, stranding the fleet until Agamemnon agrees to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia, luring her to Aulis under the pretense of marriage and cutting her throat upon the altar, an act that tears a gash in his family that will never heal. And as you watch, Clytemnestra, his wife, seethe with rage at the murder of her child. You know that Agamemnon's triumph at Troy is only the prelude to his doom, when he returns after 10 long years, bringing with him the Trojan princess Cassandra as a concubine. You trail behind him into the palace at Mycenae, where Clytemnestra, outwardly welcoming, prepares her revenge. She spreads a crimson carpet for him to walk upon, a gesture historians still debate as symbolic of hubris, since walking on such cloth was reserved for gods, not mortals. And then, once he bathes, she traps him in a net and strikes him down with an axe, the blow echoing through the halls as Cassandra, cursed always to prophesy truth but never be believed, is also slain. You pause, because the scene is thick with contradictions. Is Clytemnestra a villainous wife betraying her husband, or a grieving mother exacting justice for Iphigenia? Historians still argue to whether her portrayal reflects ancient anxieties about powerful women disrupting patriarchal order, or whether it preserves some dim echo of matrilineal societies where queens once held greater authority. But vengeance never rests in this house. And into the blood-stained halls steps Orestes, son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, torn between love for his mother and duty to avenge his father. With his sister Electra urging him on, he kills Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, and the shrieks of the Furies erupt around you, ancient spirits of vengeance who hound matricides without mercy, clawing at Orestes' sanity until he flees across Greece, a haunted figure whose story was immortalized in plays like Aeschylus' Orestia, where the climax comes not with another murder, but with a trial in Athens. As Orestes appeals to Apollo and Athena for protection, there in a groundbreaking shift from endless blood feuds to the rule of law, Athena casts the deciding vote to acquit Orestes, transforming the Furies into the Eumenides, the kindly ones, guardians of justice rather than vengeance. And you feel a strange release as the cycle of blood finally breaks, replaced with institutions of trial and jury, echoing the historical reality that Athens itself prided on moving from clan vengeance to civic order. And yet the curse lingers in your ears, because even if Orestes is freed, the myth leaves you with the unsettling truth that violence echoes through generations, each act birthing another, until only structural change, divine or human, can interrupt it. A quirky tidbit crosses your mind. Some later storytellers claimed Iphigenia wasn't sacrificed at all, but whisked away by Artemis to serve as a priestess in town, turning her into a liminal figure haunting foreign shores. And this alternate version reveals how myths splinter each retelling, seeking a different emotional resolution, some demanding blood, others mercy. As you wander through these halls of Mycenae, their stones heavy with remembered crimes, you realize the house of Atreus is less a family than a metaphor for humanity itself, always struggling between revenge and reconciliation, always haunted by the past, yet groping toward some new form of justice. And you can't help but think of how even modern dramas, from Shakespeare to soap operas, recycle these same arcs of betrayal, revenge, and the desperate hope for closure. And as you finally step out into the night air, leaving the bloody house behind, you carry with you the whisper of the Furies. Softer now, less shrill, as if even they are weary of their endless pursuit, reminding you that though the myth ends with resolution, the questions it raises about justice, family, and cycles of violence still echo in every courtroom, every feud, every whispered grudge that passes from parent to child. You step cautiously now, the marble halls of Mycenae still clinging to your feet like a shadow you can't quite shake off. But the air around you begins to cool, heavy with a dampness that smells of soil and stone, and you realize you're descending toward a place even more ancient than the squabbles of kings. Because no matter what curses mortals inherit, they all eventually walk the same path downward into the underworld. And here your journey pulls you through the crack between life and death, where the stories of gods and mortals blur into the echoes of countless souls. The Greeks imagined death not as an end, but as a migration, and you can almost see yourself joining a procession of shades across the threshold, your hands brushing past ghostly figures whispering their own names, forgotten by the living but eternally repeated here. And the first thing you notice is how ritual determines the journey. Without proper burial rites, you would be left wandering the banks of the Styx, a restless shade unable to pay Corin, the ferryman, who demands a koinon obol placed in your mouth or on your eyes, which is why archaeologists still find skeletons clutching coins in their teeth or beside their skulls. Evidence of how deeply this belief permeated real life, and historians still argue whether the coin tradition began purely as religious symbolism or as a civic ritual meant to unify the living through shared practices of mourning. When Charon finally allows you aboard his creaking boat, you drift over the Styx, that legendary river of hate, whose waters even gods swore by, and oaths sworn on it could never be broken. And as you watch the black current churn beneath you, you recall a quirky tidbit that the Greeks believed the Styx's waters were poisonous, so deadly that iron and bronze dissolved in it, and ancient travelers in Arcadia even claimed to know where the river's earthly spring bubbled from the ground. Crossing you, come face to face with Cerberus, the monstrous hound with 3 snarling heads and a serpent's tail, who normally tears apart intruders, but tonight lets you pass with a growl, as though recognizing you are here as witness rather than challenger. Past him spreads the kingdom of Hades, not aflame with fire, as later imaginations would picture hell, but gray, cold, and shadowed, an endless plain where the majority of souls simply drift, neither punished nor rewarded. Because for the Greeks, immortality was reserved for heroes or villains of grand scale, while the average person simply faded into anonymity. And that realization settles into you like a chill. Most lives, no matter how cherished in their time, dissolve into quiet shades here. But not every region is so uniform. You wander first toward the fields of Asphodel, a plain where ordinary souls wander in muted echoes of their former lives, an afterlife neither blissful nor tormenting, just endless sameness, which feels perhaps scarier than punishment because it erases individuality until you can barely tell one ghost from another. Yet deeper in, you encounter the fields of punishment, where notorious sinners are chained to their eternal dooms. Tantalus, forever thirsty and hungry as food and water recede from his grasp. A callback you smirk at, since you've already met his curse in the house of Atreus and Sisyphus, straining endlessly to push his boulder uphill only for it to roll back. A punishment so iconic that modern philosophers like Camus would later use it as a metaphor for human perseverance and absurdity. Ixion spins eternally on a fiery wheel for his crimes, while the Danaid's 50 daughters who murdered their husbands endlessly attempt to fill leaky jars with water, an image so vivid that it gave Greek a metaphor for futile labor. You pause here, noticing how much of Greek morality was expressed not in abstract sermons, but in visceral images of repetition, futility, and frustration. And you wonder whether these punishments reflect human fears more than divine justice. But then you move toward the Elysian Fields, a contrasting realm of bliss where heroes dwell. Achilles striding proudly, Orpheus strumming his lyre, and other demigods resting in peace. The sunlight here brighter, the air perfumed, almost dreamlike. Some traditions even describe Elysium as islands at the edge of the world, places of eternal spring, and you recall that historians still argue whether these images of paradise arose from Indo-European mythic traditions or were later influenced by Egyptian conceptions of the afterlife. You notice, too, that not all myths agreed. Some spoke of reincarnation, with souls drinking from the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, so they could return to mortal life cleansed of memory, while others drank from Mnemosyne, the river of memory, to achieve wisdom and escape the cycle. In fact, Archaeologists have uncovered tiny gold tablets placed in graves in southern Italy, inscribed with instructions for the dead, like cheat sheets for the underworld. Do not drink from Lethe, but from Mnemosyne, they command, suggesting mystery cults promised an escape from endless cycles for the initiated. And this discovery fascinates you, because it shows the afterlife wasn't just a vague cultural fear, but also a field of experimentation, where sects and philosophers debated the very mechanics of existence beyond death. You wander further still, and you come upon the palace of Hades and Persephone, rulers of this realm, their thrones stern, yet not cruel. Because contrary to later depictions, Hades was not satanic, but simply the custodian of the dead, feared for his impartiality and inevitability rather than malice. Persephone, half-year queen of shadows, half-year goddess of spring, embodies the cycle of life and death itself, and you realize her story, the abduction by Hades, Demeter's grief, and the compromise that allows her return each spring was less about individual romance than a grand metaphor for agricultural cycles, death, and rebirth, mirrored in grain, sprouting after lying dormant in soil. Historians still argue whether her myth originated purely as an agricultural allegory or as a political reflection of male dominance in marriage customs, but in either case, she sits before you now as proof that even in death, there is return, a rhythm pulsing through all existence. As you drift between these regions, you can't ignore how the underworld's geography mirrors the Greek world itself. Rivers flowing like borders, judges standing at gates, punishments echoing the rules of civic justice and rewards, mirroring the aristocratic privilege of heroes and nobles, for even in eternity, hierarchy lingers. A quirky tidbit springs to your mind. Plato, in his philosophical dialogues, retold myths of the underworld to argue for moral education, using the image of reincarnated souls to teach that choices in life determine one's lot in the next, turning myth into ethical thought experiment. You realize now how much the Greeks used death not to terrify but to instruct, weaving the afterlife into a framework where the living could measure their own behaviors, their rituals, and their hope for something beyond. And as you rise slowly from the depths, leaving behind Cherburu's fading growl and Curran's silent or strokes, you feel the underworld isn't just a location in their mythology. It's a mirror, a place that reflects how a culture negotiates its deepest fears and desires, how it turns the unknowable into a geography of rivers, gates, punishments, and sanctuaries. So vivid that even now, thousands of years later, you can trace the same shapes in modern stories. From Dante's Inferno to films where characters descend into dreamlike afterlives, you exhale, realizing that in walking through Hades, you've not only glimpsed the fate of souls, but also the human need to imagine that fate in detail, to make the unknowable at least narratable. And maybe that is the true power of this myth. It gives shape to the void. You emerge now from the gloom of Hades with a deep inhale, like someone who has swum for too long underwater and finally broken through the surface. And as you steady yourself, you realize that Greek mythology doesn't end with shadows, but instead echoes across centuries, woven into languages, art, philosophies, and even the tiny patterns of your own daily life. So much so that you can hardly separate the world you live in from the myths that helped form it. And this realization makes you feel like a traveler who's been walking with gods and monsters, only to find them hiding in plain sight back home. You notice first how language itself is haunted by their names. Every time someone calls a challenge Herculean or jokes about an Achilles heel, They're unconsciously invoking epics sung thousands of years ago, and every time you hear about something being a Trojan horse, you're reenacting the downfall of an ancient city. Even the word panic comes from Pan, the goat-footed god whose sudden appearances in the woods sent shepherds trembling, and the word tantalize comes straight from Tantalus, forever denied what he desires, proving how mythology seeps into everyday speech, whether we notice it or not. The myths live also in the stars above you. When you gaze at Orion's belt or Cassiopeia's chair, you're really seeing heroes and queens immortalized by gods who loved turning mortals into constellations. And the fact that sailors once navigated seas with those same star stories reminds you that mythology wasn't just bedtime distraction, but practical compass, a way of embedding human meaning into the cosmos. And while it's tempting to imagine myths as fixed, historians still argue whether they were primarily religious truths, moral lessons, or simply wildly popular entertainment, because even in antiquity, Greeks told different versions depending on the poet, the city, or the festival, meaning the myths were living things shifting and adapting like whispered secrets across generations. What's astonishing is how the Romans borrowed them wholesale, renaming god Zeus becoming Jupiter, Aphrodite becoming Venus, and then spread them across Europe, where Renaissance artists revived them with oil paints and marble statues, until suddenly these half-forgotten figures were back striding across canvases, decorating fountains and filling Shakespeare's metaphors. And even today, you scroll through films and comics where Thor swings his hammer and Wonder Woman borrows from Amazonian legends, proof that mythology keeps reinventing itself as long as humans hunger for larger-than-life stories. A quirky tidbit worth savoring is that in Victorian England, mythological names were given not just to plays and paintings, but to medicines, perfumes, even bicycles. Yes, you could once ride an Apollo or spritz yourself with Hebe's water, showing how commercialization has always latched onto ancient glamour. Just as now, corporations christen space rockets Atlas or Apollo, subconsciously hoping that a god's name might lend durability or prestige to their brand. But mythology's endurance isn't just in labels. It's in psychological frameworks too, as Freud mined Oedipus and Electra for his theories of family dynamics, while Jung used mythic archetypes to explain collective unconscious patterns. And modern therapists still reference these models, meaning that even in clinical offices where myths seem far removed, their structures still help make sense of human minds. Historians still argue whether myths' survival owes more to its adaptability or to its sheer aesthetic power. Because when you read Homer's epics, it's hard not to be seduced by the rhythm of the poetry, the thunderous speeches, and the blood-slicked battlefields, all of which feel as cinematic as any blockbuster. Yet beneath the spectacle is also philosophy. Plato and later thinkers retold myths like the cave allegory or the myth of Er, not because they literally believed in them, but because they served as scaffolds for abstract truths, demonstrating how myth bridged imagination and reason, ritual and theory. And as you reflect on this, you notice how myths still sneak into your daily routine. You sip your morning coffee brewed from beans, grown in volcanic soil, once associated with Hephaestus forges. You name your running shoes after Nike, the winged goddess of victory. You check your horoscope, which traces back to Greek constellations, and you marvel at how much of your life is quietly mythologized without your consent. You laugh softly, realizing that, in a sense, you're living inside the aftermath of Greek mythology every time you speak, dream, shop, or gaze at the night sky. Another quirky fact: in modern Greece itself, villagers in remote regions still tell folk stories that blend saints with ancient heroes, proving that mythology never died there, but merely wore new costumes, a continuity that fascinates anthropologists who study oral traditions. You think about how myths also shape identity and politics. Alexander the Great claimed descent from Achilles and Heracles to bolster his legitimacy. Renaissance cities erected statues of gods to glorify civic pride. And today, political speeches still invoke Olympian efforts or Promethean struggles, recycling the same symbolic arsenal. And then you wonder, what is it about these myths that makes them so sticky, so impossible to let go? Maybe it's because they never pretended to be perfect moral blueprints. The gods were flawed, impulsive, jealous, loving, cruel, which made them mirrors for humanity. And that honesty feels more durable than sanitized ideals. Or maybe it's because their stories provided ways of talking about timeless questions. Why do we die? Why do we suffer? Why do we dream of greatness? And what does it mean to be remembered? And you realize this: mythology isn't about answers, but about framing the questions in stories so vivid that people want to keep retelling them. And every retelling keeps them alive. Even now, as you trace back across the stories of chaos, the Titans, Zeus, thunderbolts, Prometheus' theft, Achilles' rage, Odysseus' wanderings, Orestes' curse, and Persephone's return, you see how every tale circles around survival, memory, and transformation, which are exactly the things humans wrestle with across time. And maybe you smile at the thought that someone listening to this narration, drifting to sleep with your voice, is becoming part of that same tradition, carrying the myths into tomorrow, just by remembering them. And now, with the last echoes of gods and heroes still humming faintly in your ears, you can let your body soften against the pillow. Because the journey has carried you through the void of chaos, across the thrones of titans, over battlefields of Troy, and down into the quiet halls of Hades. And yet here you are, safe and steady, heart slowing, breath easing. You imagine the myths receding like tidewater, each wave pulling back into the horizon, leaving only a calm shoreline of silence where your thoughts can finally rest. The stories may be vast, filled with thunder and fury, but right now they are nothing more than soft ripples in your mind, lulling you gently the way a steady breeze rocks the branches outside your window. If your eyelids grow heavy, that's perfectly fine. Let them close. Let the images blur. Let the names fade into something misty and dreamlike. Because that's what myths are meant to do. Carry you just far enough that the ordinary world seems softer by comparison. You are safe, you are warm, and you are allowed to rest. As the gods settle into their thrones and the heroes lay down their swords, you too can drift into sleep, knowing that tomorrow the stories will still be here, ancient yet alive, waiting to be retold when you're ready. For now, just let go, float in the quiet, and breathe.